Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today a piece of Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph. Unfortunately, I'm only going to be able to say a somewhat abbreviated share this evening, but I did not want to miss the share entirely, especially since Mem Tes Amud Aleph has quite a bit of Mishnah Berurah on it, so we will do some of it. Now, we are holding in Siman Lamed Beis. We are really at the tail end of Sif Chaf Gimel. So, yesterday at the end of the shir, we had been discussing the second halacha that the Mechaber teaches us in Sif Chaf Gimel. The Mechaber told us that if you were reviewing the parsha that you wrote, and you found that you wrote in an extra letter, in the words of the Mechaber, V'im yiter ois achas, you put in an extra letter. So the Mechaber told us, Yesh loy takana, there is a way that you may be possibly able to fix this parsha, and that is if the extra letter is the first letter of a word or the last letter of a word, then what you could do is you could simply go back and erase that letter. If you erase the letter, now the letter is gone, and there is no problem of shaloi kisidron. You took away the problematic letter. Once you take away the problematic letter, you're okay. Then the Mechaber said, however, if the letter is in middle of a word, now you have a problem. Because if you erase a letter that's in middle of a word, now you break the word into two separate words. Like the Mechaber says, the problem is, Mishum Dishiyigrar, because when you erase that extra letter, Yiyanire Kishtei Tevos, it now will look like you have two words instead of one word. Now we are in the Mishnah Berurah, 2 lines from the bottom of Menches Beis. We are up to Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Kuf Yud Aleph Sheyigror, and that's going back on when the Mechaber said Yesh loy takana. There is a possible way to fix a parsha that has an extra letter in it. Al Yidei Sheyigror Oisa, and that would be by erasing it if it's the last letter or the first letter of a word. Says the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Kuf Yud Aleph. This is very interesting what the Mishnah Berurah is pavarning. We learned earlier that there is a problem of chak teichos. So, a classic example of chak teichos would be, you wrote the letter Beis. Now, the letter Beis has a blank interior, right? The inside of the Beis is blank space that is surrounded on 3 sides. It's surrounded by the gag, by the back wall of the Beis, and by the floor, by the bottom of the Beis. Let's say ink fell into the interior of the Beis, and it filled up the interior of the Beis. When the interior of the Beis becomes full of ink, you lose the tziras ha'os of a Beis. It's no longer a Beis. So now you want to take your razor, and you want to scrape out the extra ink from the inside of the Beis. We said you cannot do that. Why? Because now you're not creating a Beis through ksiva. You originally wrote a Beis, but then the Beis became obliterated by the extra ink that fell into it, and you lost its tziras ha'os. If you now take a razor and scrape away that extra ink, what you're doing is you're creating a Beis through chak teichos, and chak teichos is aser. Well, says the Mishnah Berurah over here, in our case, what happened? You have a parsha that has an extra letter written in it. Let's say, you wrote Ve'ahavta Eis Hashem Elokecha, and when you wrote Eis, you wrote, instead of Aleph Saf, you wrote Aleph Aleph Saf. So you have 2 Alephs instead of 1. Says the Mechaber, you could take a razor and you could erase the first Aleph. You erase the first Aleph, now there's no problem. And it's not a problem of Shaloi Kisidron. There is no Shaloi Kisidron. Everything was written perfectly in order. So you erase the problematic Aleph. Suggests the Mishnah Berurah, maybe you would think that now you have a problem of chak teichos. Why? Because you had a parsha that was puzzled by virtue of the fact that it had an extra letter. You scratched away that letter, and by scratching away that letter, you kashered the parsha. Now the parsha is again a kasher parsha. Maybe that's chak teichos. You didn't make a kasher parsha through ksiva. You made a kasher parsha through chakika. So maybe that's a problem of chak teichos. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Kuf Yud Aleph, no. In this case, we don't say that the parsha is puzzle because of the psul of chak teiches. Why? Kevan she'enoi oise maise, because your action of scraping away and erasing the letter is not a maise beguf hatevais v'ha'oisios. You're not affecting the letters that remain written in the parsha. When you scrape away that extra aleph, remember the case I gave was ve'ahavta ace, and you wrote aleph suf. When you take a razor and you scratch away the extra aleph, you're not doing anything to the rest of the oisios that are going to be remaining in the parsha. So once you take away that aleph, all of the letters that are in this parsha were all written through ksiva. They were not written through chakika. In the original case that I gave you, when there is a problem of chak teiches, you wrote a beis. But after you wrote the beis was obliterated. Ink fell on it, and it was mevatel l'tzuras ha'os. Once the ink fell on the beis and it was mevatel l'tzuras ha'os, your ksiva of the beis is gone. Now, when you scratch away the ink, the beis that remains on the cloth is a beis that was created through chakika, not through ksiva. So now this parsha is puzzled because of chak teiches. It has a beis that was created through chakika. But in our case here, you write ve'ahavta eis Hashem Elokecha aleph suf. Now you take a razor and you scrape away the first aleph. Everything that's left on the cloth is now written through ksiva. There's nothing here that was created through chakika, so this is not a problem of chak teiches. A very short little Mishnah Berurah, but a very interesting one. Ois Katan Kuf Yud Beis. The Mechaber said this eitzah of scratching away the extra letter could work if the extra letter is either the first letter of the word or the last letter of the word, because then you could scrape it away, and the empty space that you create by scratching away the letter is not going to be a problem. You're just creating an empty space that's the size of one letter. According to most shittas, according to the way we paskin, you only create a problem if you have an empty space of 9 letters. If you have an empty space of 9 letters, you create separate parshias. You're making a parsha break inside the parsha. But you scratch away one letter, usually you don't have a problem. But if you scratch away a letter in middle of the word, you wrote ve'ahavta, and you wrote 2 hays. So now you're going to scratch away the extra hay in middle of the word ve'ahavta. Now you're creating a 1-letter gap inside the word. A 1-letter gap inside a word creates 2 words. So now it's ve'ah and then havta. There's no such word as va'ah, there's no such word as havta. So now that's not going to be kosher. Says the Mishnah over here, nice cut and kuf yud beis. The problem is nirik ishtei tevos. It's going to look like 2 words. Says the Mishnah Berurah, upa'amim, there are times shetikun moyel, that you can fix a word that has an extra letter in the middle by removing the word. The Mechaber says you can't do it. You take out a word in the middle of the word, you create a gap in the middle of the word, you make 2 words. Says the Mishnah Berurah, pa'amim shetikun moyel. There are times that it could work, al yedei sheyigrerena, by scratching away the extra letter, and then v'yamshich ha'ois shelafaneha, and then stretch out the letter that appeared before the extra letter, shetemale mikoima, so that letter will now fill up the empty space. And the Mishnah Berurah gives us an example. He says, Kigoyin, for example, we're now on the top line of the Mishnah Berurah on Mem Tesam and Aleph. Kigoyin, for example, La Avoisecha. You wrote the word La Avoisecha. Shekosav Mole Vav Achar Habez. The word La Avoisecha in the parsha of Tefillin is supposed to be written Chosar. It's not supposed to have a Vav after the Vez. Lamed Aleph Vez, and then there's a Cholam on the Vez, so it's La Avoi, and then right away comes the Suf with a Segol, La Avoisecha. You could put a vav between the vase and the saf, but it's written in the Torah, it's written chasar, it's written without the vav. So if you put in the vav constitutes an extra ice that does not belong there, and the tefillin would be puzzled. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Kigon la'avisecha shekasav malei vav. Let's say you wrote the word la'avisecha improperly, and you wrote it malei, so it has a vav between the vase and the saf. Achar beis, right? The vav is after the beis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you could fix it. You know how? Yigrarena, take away the vav. Scratch out the vav. Now, what's the problem? You have an empty space between the vase and the saf. Says the Mishnah Berurah, there's a very easy way to fix that. V'yimshoy chabez shalafaneha, extend the beis that came before your extra vav, shetamale mekaima, so that it should fill up the space. So, probably don't really need to do this, but let's do a little bit of an audio-visual representation over here. You had an extra vase. Okay. La'avoisecha. Okay? You had a vase, and then improperly you made a vav after the vase, and then you had the saf. So now scratch out the vav. Now the problem is that we have an empty space between the vase and the saf. That breaks the word la'avisecha in two. It's lamed aleph vase, empty space, and then it's saf yud and the chaf. So now it's two words. Says the Mishnah Berurah, there's a very easy way to fix it. All you have to do to fix it is extend the vase like so. Ta-da! I extended the vase, and now there's no longer an empty space between the vase and the saf. So says the Mishnah Berurah, there are times when you could get away with erasing an extra letter in middle of the word. And that is in a case where you could take the letter that appears before the extra word and extend it to fill up the gap. Now, many of you are thinking in your heads right now, but wait a second, Rabbi Weiss, wouldn't that constitute a problem of shaloi kisidron? Because you wrote the whole word, let's say, la'avisecha, then you went ahead and you erased the vav, so far we're okay. There's no problem of ksiva shaloi kisidron. You erased the vav. But now when you extend the vase, you're adding ksiva, you're adding writing to the vase, and you're doing it after you already wrote the saf and the yud and the chaf. Doesn't that constitute a problem of shaloi kisidron? The Mishnah Berurah is going to say, no, it does not. Why? Because you're not writing the vase now. You already wrote the vase. And the vase is a completely kosher vase. All you're doing is extending it. That does not create a problem of shaloi kisidron. The problem of shaloi kisidron is only if the vase would not be a vase, and now you're making it a vase after you already wrote the letters that come after the vase. That would be shaloi kisidron. But over here, the vase is already a vase. All you're doing is adding on to it. That doesn't create a problem of shaloi kisidron. So again, the Mishnah Berurah says, I'm going back to the bottom line of Memches Amud Beis, Upa'amim shetikun moil. There are times that it will work to erase a letter in the middle of the word. Al yidei sheyigrarena, if by wiping away, by scraping away the extra letter, v'yamshich ha'oish shelafaneha, and then extend the letter that came before the problematic extra letter that you just erased, shetamali mekaima, so that it will fill up the extra space. Kigoin la'avisecha shekasav mali vav achar beis, yigrarena, erase the problematic vav, v'yimshay chabeis shelafaneha, and then extend the beis that came before that vav, shetamali mekaima, so that it should fill up the extra space. V'chein, and similarly, says the Mishnah Berurah, im hatikun talui b'chaf oidalid oiresh. If you're going to fix a word where there's an extra letter that came after a chaf, or after a dalit, or after a reish. She'efshar lahamshichan ma'at lamale mokem ha'oisa yisera shenigura. In the case of all of these letters, these are all letters that you could easily extend to fill up the gap created by erasing the problematic extra letter. Aval. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ima oisiyoi she'efshar lahamshichan hein achar ha'oisa yisera. But let's say the letters that you could theoretically extend are after the extra letter. She'i efshar lahamshichan la'acharein. See, a reish you could always extend, right? But when we say that you could extend a reish, you could extend a reish in one direction, right? Here you have a reish. Very easy to extend a reish. All we do is add on another piece to the gag. We add on another piece to the gag and we extend the reish. But could you extend the reish backwards? No. The only way you could extend the reish backwards is by first erasing the regel. If you erase the leg of the reish, then you could extend the gag of the reish out to the right and then make a new regel. So yes, you could theoretically extend a reish backwards, but in order to extend the reish backwards, you have to take away the regel. Now that's already going to create a problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Aval ima oisiyoi she'efshar lahamshichan. If the letters like the reish or the beis or the dalid or the chaf, which we call letters that you could extend, if they come achar ha'oisa yisera, if those letters only appear after the extra problematic letter, she'i efshar lahamshichan la'acharein, and these letters, you could extend them forward, but you can't extend them backward. Ad sheyigrar mehem tchila. The only way you could extend them backwards is if first you scratch away the regel, the back wall of the letter. Kigoin, for example, says the Mishnah Berurah, the word se'oyer. We have the word se'oyer in two of the parshas of Tefillin, I believe. So the word se'oyer, shekasav b'Torah, that appears in the Torah and is in the parshas of Tefillin, sheksava mole. It's supposed to be written chasar, sin aleph resh. But you wrote it mole, vav achara aleph. You wrote sin aleph vav resh. Now the resh is one of the letters that you could extend. But you could only extend it forward. You can't extend it backward. And the extra vav appears before the resh. So you're going to scratch away the vav. Now you have an empty space between the aleph and the resh. Could you extend an aleph? You can't extend an aleph forward. There's nothing there to extend forward. So you can't fill up the space that's going to be left by the removal of the vav by extending the aleph forward. Nor can you extend the resh backward. Now you'll say, yes, I could extend the resh backward. Yeah, how? By wiping out the regel of the resh and then going backward. Says the Mishnah Berurah, she'iev shalimshach haresh la'achareha. You cannot extend the resh backwards. Ad sheyigra ragla tchila. First, you would have to take away the regel of the resh. V'nimtza shebitel tzurasa. Now the problem is, if you're going to take away the regel of the resh, you're mevatel the tzura of the resh. So you take away the regel of the resh. Now it's no more resh. Now you extend it backwards to fill up the empty space created by the erasure of the vav. And now you make a new regel to the resh. You know what you just did? You just erased the resh and wrote a new resh. Now that's a problem. When you create the new resh, ninsa kaisiv shaloikis hidron. Let's say you wrote the word se'or, but you also wrote further what comes after se'or. So let's say it's the pasuk se'or b'chol gvuleka. Right? So you wrote se'or, and you wrote b'chol. Now you looked back, and you saw that when you wrote se'or, you stuck in an extra vav. So what are you going to do? You're going to take out the vav, you're going to create an empty space in the word se'or. The aleph, you can't extend forward. So you'll say, okay, I'll extend the resh backward. In order to extend the resh backward, you have to take off the regel. You take off the regel, you're mavatal the tzura of the reish. Now you extend the reish backward to fill up the gap. You make a new regel. You just wrote a new reish. But you already wrote the words that come after the word sa'ar. So when you create this reish now, you're writing shaloi kisidron, and you just pasaled your parsha. Ve'in takana. So therefore, in that case, ein takana ela im ken yachal lamalois b'kaimai. The only eitzah that you have in this case is if you could fill up the gap al yidei she'ya'abek tzas ha'ois shelafaneh v'shela'achareha. Unless what you could do suggests the Mishnah Berurah is like this. You had the word se'or. Just making an aleph, and now making a resh. Okay, you had the word se'or. You wrote sin, aleph, vav, resh. The problem is that now you erased the vav, and because you erased the vav, you've got an empty space between the aleph and the resh. There's no way to extend the aleph forward. The only way to extend the resh backwards is to remove the gag, to remove the leg, extend the gag, make a new leg. But that would be ksiva, and that would be shaloi kisidron if you already wrote the words that come or the letters that come after the word sa'ar. Says the Mishnah Berurah, there's one eitzah. The only eitzah is maybe you could fill up the gap by making the resh bigger. What does that mean? Making the aleph and the resh, we're going to make them bigger and thicker. Now, it's not proportionate. What I'm doing over here is not a great picture, but it just gives you the idea. If what you could do is, you can add on ink to the resh and add on ink to the aleph, so that you make the letters bigger and thicker. By doing that, you could close up the gap between the aleph and the resh without losing the tzura of the resh or the aleph, so that you don't create a shaloi kisidron problem. Now, the poskim say that when you do this, you have to be very careful. And I'll show you very quickly why. Because, you see, when you write a resh, okay, here's my resh. Here's a resh. Now, if I'm going to add ink to the resh on the back to make it thicker, what happens if I start to add the ink at the top? I'm going to show you what happens. I want to add ink to the resh, and I want to make the resh bigger. So I started up here at the back of the gag, and I made the gag bigger. What letter do I have now? I have a dalet. Now, even if I just do that for a second, but I created a dalet. By creating a dalet, I was mevatel the tzura of the resh. Now, when I continue my addition down to the bottom, it's very nice that ultimately I have a resh again. But first I was mevatel the tzura of the resh and I turned it into a dalet, and then I rewrote it into a resh. But that means that I made the resh now. If I wrote the letters that come after the resh, now I have a problem with shaloi kisidron. So using this eitzah, the poskim say, we have to be very, very careful. Says the Mishnah Berurah. So the Mishnah Berurah said here, V'ein takona elim ken yachal amalis b'kaim al yidei sheyabek tzasoi shalafanev shalachareh she'ein bazeh mishum shinui ha'ois. Ma she'ein ken kisha ha'ois yoy she'efshar lahamshichan hein lifnei ha'ois ha'yisera. But going back to what the Mishnah Berurah said at the beginning, but if you have a letter that you could extend forward that came before the problematic extraneous letter, then you're okay, because you take out the extra letter and then you extend the previous ice forward to close the gap. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, yesh lihistapik. Now he gives us a case where we have a suffix. Yesh lehistapek b'matzois harishon. With the word matzois, the first word matzois that appears in the parsha of Tefillin, shedinoi lihiyos chaser. That word matzois is supposed to be written chaser without a vav. It's supposed to be mem tzadik saf. Uksavai molei, and you wrote it molei. So you wrote mem tzadi vav saf. Now let's apply the rules that we just learned. Okay, you have an extra letter in the middle of the word. The Mechaber said if you take away an extra letter in the middle of the word, you run into a problem because you create a gap in the middle of the word. Now it looks like two words. And the Mishnah Berurah said sometimes we could get away with it. How? If you could remove the letter that's in the middle of the word, and then you could go to the letter that appeared before it, and you could extend it to fill up the space, you're okay. Classic example was you have the word la'avoisecha. So you had an extra vav between the vase and the saf. Take away the vav, extend the vase to fill up the gap between the vav and the saf. How are you going to extend the vase? You're going to extend the gag of the vase, and you're also going to extend the floor of the vase. By the time you're finished with your extensions, there's no more gap between the vav and the saf. Beautiful. Said the Mishnah Berurah also, sometimes you could have another letter. You could have a resh. Maybe the extra letter that you wrote came after a resh. All right, erase the extra letter, take the gag of the resh, and extend the gag of the resh. No more empty space. It no longer looks like two words. You're okay. Now says the Mishnah Berurah, but now I'll give you a case that's not so simple. Matzois with an extra vav. Mem, tzadik, vav, saf. Erase the vav. Now you have an extra space between the tzaddik and the saf. Now the tzaddik could be extended. Why? Because the tzaddik has a floor. It has a piece at the bottom. The piece at the bottom you could extend forward. So a resh, we said you could extend a resh because the resh has a regel, but it has a gag. So you could extend the gag forward. You extend the gag forward, it fills up the gap. The tzaddik doesn't have a gag that you could extend, but it has a base. It has a floor that you could extend. Says the Mishnah Berurah, I'm not sure if that's effective. When you have a resh and you extend the gag of the resh, it's true that you're only extending the top. You're not extending the bottom. But the resh doesn't have a bottom. So every single resh in a Sefer Torah or in Tefillin, there's always empty space between the bottom of the regel of the resh and the next letter. That's the nature of a resh. The gag extends over empty space. But that's not the nature of a tzaddik. The nature of a tzaddik, the nature of a tzaddik is that the top of the tzaddik and the bottom of the tzaddik, generally speaking, I'll write it a little bit better. Generally speaking, the floor, the base of the tzaddik, here I wrote a new tzaddik, this mirror image gets me every time, down here. The end of the top of the tzaddik is usually level with the end of the base of the tzaddik. So the top of the tzaddik on its left side isn't over empty space. It's usually over the floor. Now, if you're going to extend it, let me make a bigger one, so it comes out better on the camera. Here you have the typical tzaddik. So the base ends over here, and the top ends over here. Now you want to extend the tzaddik to fill up the gap that was created when you erased the extra vav that was between the tzadi and the saf. You had an extra vav. You want to fill up the gap. So what you're going to do is you're going to extend the floor of the tzaddik. But look what you have now. Now you have the floor of the tzaddik extending all the way out to here, but there's nothing above it. That's a very strange tzaddik. So says the Mishnah Berurah, in that case, I'm not sure that the extension is effective. Let's see it inside. Ach yesh lehistapek b'matzos harishon shedinoi liyos chaser. That word matzos is supposed to be written chaser without a vav after the tzaddik. Uksavay molei, and you wrote it molei. Umakar achaksaf avav. And then you erased the vav, creating an empty space between the tzaddik and the saf. Imoyel arichas hatzadik lemata achakach, we're misupik if extending the bottom of the tzaddik is effective to fill up the gap. Oidilma, or maybe kol oid she'enoi maricha ois lamaila, as long as you're unable to extend the ois at its top, like a tzaddik, you can't extend the top of the tzaddik. So the top of the tzaddik is still going to be far away from the saf. It's only at the base of the tzaddik that the gap is going to be filled up. Maybe still nechshav kishnei tevois. Maybe now it's still considered like two words. Afal pisha smacha milamata. Even though it's very close to the next letter at the bottom. V'chein, and similarly, noisein. Let's say the word noisein. Shemishpatoi liyos chaser, which should be written chasar, without a vav between the nun and the saf. V'chein hoitziacha, or the word hoitziacha, im kisavai molei biyud, bein tzadik la'alef. You put a yud between the tzadik and the aleph. B'chol elu yesh lehistapek, im yesh lehem tikun b'ha'aricha ois shalafanav lamata. In all of these cases, noisein is very, very similar. Noisein is a nun kifufa, and then there's a saf, and you created a gap between the nun and the saf by taking away an extra vav. So now you extend the nun, and you extend it at its bottom. So now you extended it at the bottom, so it's very nice that at the bottom the nun and the saf are very close, but at the top they're still far away. Is that effective? Now you'll ask me, Rabbi Weiss, extend the top too. You can't extend the top. You know why? Because if you extend the top, what letter do you have now? Now you have a chaf. So you can't extend the top also. You can only extend the bottom. And Mishnah Berurah says, we're misupik if that is effective or not. Nevertheless, even though the Mishnah Berurah is mentioning this suffix, so the Mishnah Berurah is talking about this case where you extend the bottom of one of these letters, and he's misupik what that extension does. Does that extension serve to join the two parts of the word, or do we say that it looks like two different words? Despite the fact that I'm mentioning this suffix, kol shenirik ishtei teva is psula. The rule of thumb is if it looks like two words, it's two words and it's possible. Aval. In betchilas haksiva, mamshich regal atachton shalanun v'atzadi. Let's say when the Sefer was writing, he wrote a funny nun. He wrote a funny tzaddik. And he extended the base, the floor of the nun or the tzaddik. He extended it for some crazy reason. He extended it very far. And then he wrote the next letter inside the extension. And he gives a case here. Kigoin penei. Let's say the word penei. Pei, nun, yud. The Sefer wrote penei, but look what he did. He wrote a pei, then he wrote a nun. And he wrote the nun with a very long foot. Where's the yud? The yud is inside the nun. It's actually inside the space, the airspace of the nun, because it's above the extended floor of the nun. Oy artzi, or he wrote aleph reish tzadi yud to write the word artzi, and he extended the floor of the tzaddik beneath the yud. Kosher. Mishnah Berurah says it's kosher. Kevin de beteva achas nichtevu, because it was written as one word. Umikamakam lechatchila einachad lasos came, but certainly lechatchila it should not be written that way. lahavlia ois besoich ois, to swallow up one letter inside of another letter, like this case where the yud is swallowed up inside the nun or the tzaddik, kiyesh machmirin bazeh, because there are certainly those that are machmir not to do this. Okay? We're going to break over here. We'll continue next time here at Hashem with Sif Chaf Dalet. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. Schus of Limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael, the Roshim should send Yeshua Sefuas Parnasset Sheduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Gerel Tzedek B'mehera v'yameinu Amen. Be well.